All right. Hey, everyone. Happy Halloween. Hope you're having a good day so far. Thanks for coming. When I'm sure there's lots of festivities that you could be choosing to spend your time at, and I'm happy that you came to listen to Gary today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Gary Hsieh. Gary started in the department in 2011. Is that right? 2013. Oh, I knew it was like off from 2012. I thought it was the other way. 2013. So yeah, just over 11 years here. And his work primarily focuses on designing and for behavior change, as well as thinking about how we can do scientific communication and technology translation. And so Gary is unique in the department in that he and I probably have the longest history together between anyone else in the department. So we were both undergraduates, and he was a student at UC Berkeley. And I was a visiting student through their REU program, and we collaborated on a project that I think is still like one of our most highest cited papers. So we were both co-authors on a paper on ambient displays, which neither of us really do much work on these days. It was a heuristic evaluation of ambient displays paper. So we'll forever have that connection, which is really fun to hear. So Gary is going to be talking to us today about accelerating research translation into design practice using generative AI. So I will hand it over to Gary.
All right. Can y'all hear me okay? Move this up a little bit. Is that good? All right. Awesome. I wasn't supposed to be here today. We kind of have needed an extra person to fill in, so I'm jumping in, even though my kids are out trick-or-treating, and I don't want to stand in between you and trick-or-treating, so we can make this a little bit more interactive. Feel free to just jump in if you have questions. I thought I'd use this time to kind of talk to you about some of our more recent research on kind of using generative AI for translational work. But before I do that, in case you don't know me, just want to do a quick background. So as Julie mentioned, I did my undergraduate at UC Berkeley, and what I was doing there was in computer science. But I'm sure as many of you here seated in the audience, if you have a tech background but you're interested in human-centered design, a lot of the times we just feel like we want to make sure that technology advancement is actually done appropriately for the users and not just advancing technology for the sake of, improving technology. And so that really drew me into the interdisciplinary field of human-computer interaction and human-centered design. And so for my graduate program, I was in an interdisciplinary program where I was able to combine kind of social and behavioral theories into the design of technology. And I'm really excited about research as this intersection, right? So on one hand, through advances in social and behavioral psychology, we can design better technologies. On the other hand, through sort of these novel technologies, we can come up with, leverage these new technologies to study people in ways that were never available to us before, and then come up with additional insights, then we can design better technologies. And so a lot of my research is on how do we design kind of motivators, messages, strategies to influence people to do positive change. And this is an example of a work that I've done, which is how do we kind of think about the design of incentives to get people to participate. And one of the things that I pointed out in this work that we've actually empirically demonstrated is that different types of incentives actually attract different types of people, right? In some ways it's intuitive, right? If you pay money to get people to use your products, you're going to attract a certain types of users. Whereas if you offer donation incentives, you might actually attract a different set of users. And these different types of users can actually influence and affect what kind of communities that you're building, what your products end up looking like. But one of the things that also happened when I was doing this work and thinking about sort of impact when I was going up for tenure is I started asking this question. I do all this work that I think is really interesting and exciting, but are people actually reading them? I publish these papers, and some of them get best paper awards, but do people actually read these papers? Especially, do design practitioners actually read these papers, right? A lot of what we do in human-centered design is sort of founded on this idea that we can build better technologies by providing, better understanding of people, right? And so if we're doing all these work, we're generating all these design implications, but no one's actually reading these papers, then kind of what's the point? And this is actually, for me, an increasingly important problem, right? So if we look at kind of the publication rate over time, we're seeing that there's more papers that are being generated by the academia, right, by research scholarship. So, some studies have shown that scientific outputs double every 17 years. So imagine the amount of papers we have now being published every year. In 17 years, that number is going to double, right? And so we have more papers that are being generated by more researchers than ever before, right? And I imagine with generative AI, that's going to actually be even more so, right? This was done before generative AI came out. And so what's going to happen is that there's going to be a lot of this knowledge that's being published, but people just don't have the capacity to kind of read through all these papers that are being published. And so this is an important problem from many different perspectives, right? From the public side, we are supposed to be able to support evidence-based decision-making, right? Our claim is that by doing the research that we do, we can help designers build better technologies. We can help, public health policymakers make more informed decisions. But if they're not reading these papers, that's not happening, right? It's also, if we don't sort of effectively communicate the work that we're doing, they're also more prone to kind of misinformation that's being communicated. Right? This is also important from a researcher's perspective. I mean, obviously, we do this because we want to make an impact, but if no one's going to sort of engage with our work, we're not making that happen. Also, there's value for us to communicate with practitioners because there's ways for them to kind of bubble up, share their insights back to us, right? Kind of let us know if they've tested it in their context and it does or doesn't work. Help us validate findings. And finally, right, there's important discussions about public support and interest in science. Right? A lot of times, the public doesn't feel like the academics are talking to them, right? And so that leads to more distrust in science. And so that leads to some of our work, right? We started by trying to understand, what are some of these research practice gaps, right? Why is this happening? Why aren't, our practitioners reading our papers? And so we started by interviewing a bunch of design practitioners, UI, UX practitioners, trying to understand, are they reading academic papers? And if not, why not? And as you can imagine, many of them claim that they're interested in sort of the knowledge embedded in these papers, but few of them are actually reading these papers. Right? And if I were to summarize some of the key reasons, one of them is understandability. Right? When I think of research, I think I'm going to have to slowly go through tons of reading with big vocabulary words because someone wanted to sound smart. That's what one of our participants said. And in some ways, it's not surprising. I think even those of us who have been doing research for a while, when we are sort of reading papers from other fields, we feel the same way, right? Each communities of practice, each communities of research have their own ways of talking about things. Even their papers are structured in some ways that's sometimes hard to read, right? And so with our PhD students, usually one of the important skills to have is how to read papers, right? And if you talk about more of a lay audience, people who haven't gone through this training, that's hard to do. Another important sort of issue or why practitioners aren't really engaged with the research that we're publishing is that oftentimes they don't find value in the papers that we write, right? And so I love these pictures, right, because these are cool images, but at the same time, when you really look at it, thinking about it, it's like, well, they don't quite work, right? And so this is also something that's been discussed by a lot of scholars before, right? So if you look at kind of the diffusion of innovation, right? Talk about how do we get people to adopt these innovation. One of the key things is, do people perceive value in the work, in the product, in the innovation, right? If not, they're not going to adopt it. And one of the papers that I like a lot is there was this work that was done looking at kind of what practitioners or designers want from academic papers, how they assess academic papers. And they came up with kind of these 6 categories of things that when they read academic papers, right? They want to make sure that it's valid, it's grounded in some sort of data or theory. They want to make sure it's generalizable, it's applicable beyond some specific setting. They want to make sure it's original, some sort of novelty, right? But they also want to make sure that it's generative, that it opens up new design spaces, that's inspire, like it motivates implementation, and it's actionable, feasible in implementation. What I like about this work is that if you kind of sit back and take a look at these, you kind of notice that, in sort of the scholarly publication context, when we do peer evaluation, what we often focus on are the metrics on the right. Right? So when we review paper and we're deciding whether or not to accept a paper, we're asked to rate whether or not the work is valid, whether or not it's generalizable, whether or not it's original. But we don't really think about the ones on the left, right? Sorry, on your right, right? And so there's kind of a gap, right? There's a difference in kind of what we're trying to maximize in our community versus what practitioners may want in sort of these types of artifacts. Another issue, obviously, is access, right? Certainly when we started doing this work, kind of behind paywall has been a big thing. I'd say that has been improved quite a lot over the past few years. But there's always sort of the secondary access, which is not knowing how to access these papers. Right? So even if you can go to these online scholarly repositories and get to our papers, you might not know what words to use. Right? One participant said, "The biggest problem that I think with design academia is I don't know what I don't know. I lack the vocabulary to find that very specific field in literature. Often they have very specific names, and the literature has all been authored with that knowledge built in." And so those are some of the key barriers, right? Some of the key reasons behind the so-called research and practice gaps. And generally, there's just these underlying structural differences, right? Differences in incentives and focus. And there's another quote that I like. "If you ask me to choose between academic research and my own user research with my users, I would always rather take mine, because the user research tells you, can my users understand that? What we're delivering is a product for those users to use. I don't care if my design doesn't work for anyone else. I just need it to work for the people that I care about." In fact, so much so, this is kind of reflected in kind of how our students think about it, that I think when we ask people about, what's your typical human-centered design process, their immediate reaction is, let's go talk to some users, right? And that's great, right? I think that's certainly a key part of human-centered design. But my challenge there is, why don't you go do some research, look up some papers to see if anyone has done this work already, right? Why is our intuition always, let me go talk to some users first? And just to be clear, these types of translational problem isn't just a human-centered design or a design problem, right? This is a problem that's been talked about in many fields, such as management science or in health. In fact, the term sort of translational science is a term that's kind of coined in biomedical research. And what they're working on is how do you translate kind of the research that's done from bench side, think about folks in lab coats, right, doing sort of working with chemicals and sort of various viruses or whatnot, to bedside, right? How do you actually then translate that into something that the patients will receive bedside? And they talk about sort of various types of translational gaps, right? How do you go from the initial basic science to kind of clinical trials, et cetera? And so as part of that, we also wanted to see what kind of model, we wanted to understand what is that flow in a lot of the work that we do in human-centered design and human-computer interaction, right? And so we also built the translational model of HCI, and this is work done after interviewing a bunch of various kind of members in the translational flow, right? So this includes researchers, this includes practitioners, this also includes, educators and journalists, right, who may be part of these flows. And one of the things that, I'm not going into too much depth into this, but a few things to note, right, just contrasting between this and kind of the medical model, is that there's quite a lot more back and forth between these stages here, right? So instead of just more of a linear flow, I'd say a lot of our work, there's sort of back and forth between sort of these communities. It also jumps, right? Whereas you have, again, more of a linear flow from start to end in the medical context, you can potentially jump from basic research to some sort of insights for design practitioners, right? So, Freakonomics or sort of those pop sci books are sort of attempts at sharing some of those basic science to the general public. But I would say it's also possible because we don't have the type of regulation that you would see in a health context, right? So in a health context, they really care about sort of the step-by-step regulation and tests to make sure that these things are what they say it's it is and that it's going to work. We don't really have that, right? You can just put anything in the App Store tomorrow, and who knows kind of whether it's going to work or not, right? And I'll talk a little bit about kind of just this one gap, right? And so when we generally think about the research translation problem, it's generally kind of applied to design, at least in kind of the human-centered design, human-computer interaction context. Right. Here, what we want to do is we want to translate knowledge into resources, considering very specific application domains. And some of the barriers are kind of applicability, right? So it goes back to the issue that I was talking about, perceived value of the research that's being done in academia. And so if you're a practitioner, you're looking at these papers and you're wondering, how do I apply this in my work? Does it actually apply? Does it work? Right? So we've been doing this for a few years, and we've noticed these problems. And the question, with kind of us as human-centered design is always, what can we do about it, right? How can we bridge some of these gaps? So I'll talk today, the rest of the talk, I'll talk about some of the tools and the resources that we've been exploring to bridge some of these gaps. So the first kind of general direction that I want to talk about are sort of translational artifacts, right? And so the question here is really, academic papers were never meant to sort of be as an artifact that's communicating to broader audiences. If you trace back the history of sort of academic papers, it was these papers that were shared amongst folks in the learned societies, right? These sort of scientists, mathematicians, or whatnot. And so they're not meant to communicate to broader audiences, right? They were just not designed for it. In HCI, in our field, we tried to do that a little bit. So there's always this discussion about including design implications in your papers, right? Trying to communicate with kind of practitioners in these papers. And again, the fact is just that most practitioners aren't even engaged with these papers, even though we have these sections written in the papers. And so that raises an interesting question. What if we kind of throw away paper and throw away the assumption that our papers are going to help us communicate these insights? Are there other formats that we can envision, right? Are there other artifacts that we can use to translate these knowledge to design practitioners? One thing that I've always liked when I was doing design is sort of thinking about design patterns, right? I don't know if you've engaged with this in some of your classes or in some of your work, right? Design patterns came out from the field of architecture, and really the point of these patterns are trying to communicate solutions, reusable solutions to commonly faced problems. So imagine you're designing, doing some architectural space design, and you're trying to think about, what should I do with these long corridors, right? How do I make it sort of more lively? And so here's a pattern, right? Make sure it's not too long, and also make sure that there's sufficient lighting, potentially create these alcoves, sort of spaces with furniture in it so that people can gather, so that there's sort of more interaction in the space. And this idea of patterns also has been adapted in various different contexts. Those of you who are more development background, you've heard of software engineering patterns. Same idea, right? If you're kind of human-centered design, UI, UX designers, you've also heard of patterns. And we talk about it in terms of various type of design patterns. A great example of this is shopping carts, right? So imagine there was no shopping carts on Amazon. And if you want to purchase things, you would have to click on something and buy, click on something and buy, click on something and buy. But through a shopping cart design pattern, what that allows you to do is you get to put it in the virtual shopping cart. You can put many items in there and then check out all at one place, all at one time, right? These are design patterns. Again, if you're building an e-commerce site, you're using these types of patterns. So what if we can do something like this with the research that we're creating, right? And so for the past few years, I've been teaching our Designing for Behavior Change class. I don't know, maybe some of you in the audience will take it with me in spring. One thing that you're going to be asked to do is generate design cards. Okay. So what I get students to do is we take these readings, and then for each of these readings, I ask them to generate kind of a design card that can communicate these insights. Right? So what is an interesting insight that you found from these papers? See if you can communicate in a card format that another practitioner or designer may be able to pick up. So this is an example of a card on the health belief model, right? And so on these cards, we played around with various sort of templates, versions of these, right? This is the most recent version that we've adopted. But basically, on these cards, you have kind of the strategy depicted or sort of spelled out, some sort of abstract image to provide inspiration about what the strategy is, right? A little bit of description of what the strategy is, and then some do's and don'ts related to the strategy. We also have sort of the name of this theory specifically, or the construct up there, so that if you do want to engage with the underlying science, you can, trying to help do some of this bridging. That's just one side of the card, right? The other side, what we want to do is trying to improve and support actionability. So what we have is we have students generate sort of, or find examples of where the strategy exists. Maybe something that they've seen before in other apps, or maybe this is something that they mock up, right? To kind of showcase how the strategy works, so that if you're looking at it as a practitioner, you're like, I'm interested in this strategy, but I don't know what to do with this. You can potentially come to this page and get some insights. We also get them to explain how the design works, and then why the strategy works. Try to provide data and references. Again, that's trying to increase our ability to assess the validity and kind of the generalizability of these strategies. We also have kind of an ethical consideration section, thinking about the ethical implications of applying these strategies. And so, as I mentioned, we've been doing this for a few years, and sort of every class, the fun part is that we generate sort of these decks, and every year we have sort of these decks. I think that link is actually down. Lucas, the PhD student who is driving this work, is updating his website, but I'll have to figure out a way to get that link back up. But we have sort of these decks available for people to sort of browse, and we use some of these classic behavior change theories in our work, right? And to generate these cards. But that also got us thinking, right? That works for some of these theories, but how do we scale, right? Yeah, maybe I can offer this class every year, but with what, 20, 30 students, how many of these cards can we translate? How many of these papers can we translate, right? Is there a way to kind of do this at a larger level, right? And also, who should be doing this work, right? We certainly can't expect students to be doing this work all the time, right? They're doing it in class as a sort of an exercise, but we can't just assume that students will do this for the papers that they're reading. And that leads to some interesting questions, right? Who should be doing this type of, uncompensated work, right? And that's kind of the problem right now, is that this type of work is not being compensated, right? If you're a practitioner, no one's going to pay you extra for reading more papers and translating this for other people to use. If you're a researcher, you're not really sort of being supported by this per se as well, right? And further, right, practitioners, they might not have the time or the ability to actually understand the papers, as we talked about. They don't have the expertise. Whereas researchers, well, we know we don't have the time, but like I said, we're also not properly incentivized. I will also note that, as many of you know from your interactions with various professors and teachers, some of the best researchers are also not the best teachers. And so we can't assume that the researchers will know how to translate their work effectively either, right? And so what do we do? Well, others have been talking about these problems as well, right? So Don Norman actually in 2010 talked about what we need are translational developers, right? This new brand of individuals who will act between researchers and sort of practitioners and do some of this translational work. And in health contexts, you can definitely apply and sort of get degrees in translational science and sort of act as these fellows in place doing some of this work. But again, this type of training is expensive, right? If you think about it from an organizational perspective, what might end up happening is that those who have the resources to do this can do this, and those who don't won't, right? So that also becomes an equity kind of an issue, right? And so who's going to be doing this work? And so what we've been exploring in the past 2 years is, can we use generative AI to do this work, to kind of facilitate this? I'm going to attempt at doing a demo here. We'll see how it turns out. People always caution against doing live demos, but we will see. Let me see. Kind of want to see my screen, but so we have built a website. You can go check it out, paperdecart.com. And what you do is you upload a paper in there, and you can select parts of the paper that you want to do some translation. So let me just see. I've already uploaded a paper, and this is the paper that I was talking about, sort of incentives and sort of encouraging participation. Now, I'm just going to highlight some sections. And see if this works. So in theory, what's going to happen is that the generative AI will create a design card out of the sections that I've highlighted. Well, I won't waste your time. I have it backed up on another. So I just want you to pay attention to this. So this is the card that gets generated. Okay, so if I uploaded that paper, highlighted those sections, this is the card that's generated. And we can read through it, right? Tailoring incentives for diverse participants. So on the top left, it talks about the design strategy, okay? And whatchamacall. And we provide kind of an image, again, to provide that inspiration. And we provide a bit of summary about this paper. The authors presents 2 empirical studies showing that different incentives in crowdworking influences who participates in tasks. They found that lottery rewards attract participants with openness to change values, while charity rewards attract those with self-transcendence values, impacting task outcomes accordingly. And these days, sort of NLP is actually really good at summarizing. And so that's kind of what it's doing in that section. But the left side, what we're doing is we're sort of grabbing the design implications and trying to be a little bit more generative. And we're also trying to connect it back to where in the paper does it provide this insight, right? So provide you a little bit of evidence as you're looking at it. You're like, I don't know if I trust this, right? Which part of this paper actually provide this design guideline? And it talks a little bit about which section that's from. So I kind of showed you what the end product looks like. I'll kind of go through a little bit our process, right? So the first thing that we wanted to do is we want to say, okay, we've been doing these design cards for a few years. We're like, this is probably a good way of communicating some of these insights, right? So how do we, but what kind of sections should go in here, given the limitations or sort of what generative AI can do? And so we conducted a preliminary study with 12 designers. And we sort of gained some of these insights. Again, thinking about title as a means to guide action, right, without being too directive. Coming up with a description section that tells designers about the target users, design subject, and justification. Come up with an image that represents the potential usage context of the application with colors to inspire creativity, right? Summary of the paper for helping them understand the overall context of the paper. Provide the evidence to serve as the ground for the design implication, and then citations so that if you do want to go back to the paper, you can. Right? We're here to kind of bridge. And so this is kind of as you saw, this overall structure of the cards. If you're interested in kind of the implementation details, I see Dong-Hoon just walked in. You can also ask him afterwards for some of the details. He's driving this work. But essentially, we're taking sort of both the paper to provide sort of summaries, but also snippets of the paper to provide to grab the design implications and sort of create the cards. And essentially, our research question is, can generative AI help support the translation of design implications, right? Is this content of the card accurate, right? Is this good enough? Is this feasible to do this? And also, can the cards support designers' needs with design implications? And that also meant that we wanted to do a study to kind of test this. So what we did is we recruited designers and we surveyed and interviewed them. We recruited about 21 of them. And each of the participants was presented with 2 design cards and also 2 raw texts from the papers, right? So these papers have design implication sections. So we show them the design card and the raw text, and kind of the order is randomized. And for each of these, we asked them to evaluate along the 6th dimension, the 6 ones that I've talked about previously, right? Validity, originality, generalizability, inspirability, generativity, and actionability. And we wanted to see our hope, right, was that it shouldn't really influence validity or originality, right, or even generalizability, because we're not changing the underlying science. But what we're hoping is that with these cards, it could increase inspirability, generativity, and actionability. At the same time, we also invited the authors themselves to participate in our study, right? So we selected a set of papers, but we also invited the authors of those papers to participate in our study. And we asked them, their perceptions toward the design cards and also future enhancements. Right? Just going to jump into sort of our findings. Right? So as you can see, when we compared the raw text to the design card, as we kind of hypothesized, there's really no significant difference between validity, generalizability, and originality. But we did show that with our design cards, participants definitely found it to be more generative, more inspiring. Although there was also, again, no difference between actionability. We then analyzed some of our qualitative findings, right? Trying to really understand why do they feel this way, what are some of their perceptions. We found that the visual hierarchy and the visual elements made design cards appealing and easy to consume, right? It helps with them, getting them kind of inspired just by looking at these cards, much more so than reading a block of text. Our design cards also afforded digestibility and ease of understanding through concise language, right? Part of it is teasing out the jargons of the paper and make it more accessible to practitioners. Our system also supported communication of design implications without loss of validity and originality, right? As mentioned, they didn't think that it was less valid or less original, right? Because really it's just the same set of design implications that we got from the cards. And seeing the evidence and the citation also add a little bit more to the credibility. Right? There were some issues with kind of accuracy and biases related to generative images, and that's something that we'll just have to continue to work on. But that's also something to keep in mind when you're using sort of generative AI in these processes. And so kind of a summary of this work, right? Designers found that our AI-generated cards were more inspiring and generative while maintaining validity, originality, and generalizability. We can also demonstrate that it can feasibly utilize generative AI to produce these design cards, right? We came up with a pipeline to do that. And sort of you can then imagine this broadly applied to any of the papers that are being published and sort of try to generate these design cards. Our analysis did show that potentially we can make it even more actionable compared to the design implications presented in the papers, but that's something that we can and we did explore, as I'll talk about next. Before I move on, any questions about this? Yeah, go ahead.
So for the images that you're generating, like how do you sort of prompt it to do that? Because there's like some discretion there, right, in terms of what you want to represent visually.
Yeah. We definitely iterated on the image generation prompts. Dong-Hoon, do you want to answer on the specifics?
We use UTAP prompting where we fed multiple examples that have like the original design implication to author-created illustration of like potential use case, and then we fed like four examples of them, and then whenever the user like creates another like design card, the model will use the design
Cool. Thanks for coming, by the way. Well, I'll move on. Certainly, if you have other questions, just raise your hand. Oh, go ahead. Right. So the question is whether or not there are other tools in the market that allows them to do this. There's much more so. So if you look at semantic scholars' work, right, there's more sort of general audience, right, trying to understand research papers, but it's not directed towards the sort of the design audience. And that's what we're trying to do, support sort of this type of translation with this audience, right? But that's also kind of for me, the inspiring part of this work, right? What generative AI is enabling us to do is that it's making sort of these documents much more fluid than ever before. So instead of thinking about traditional papers as sort of the document in which we need to use to communicate our findings, we can come up with any other format, right, through generative AI. And one of the things that also is kind of underlying sort of the research practice gap is this problem of rigor and relevance divide. And the argument has always been that there's this gap is because researchers focus on rigor in their work. They're trying to get, demonstrate the validity with this specific population. They want to demonstrate there's a strong effect size, it's significant, whatnot, right? And they're trying to do good research. They're trying to define research problems precisely and investigate them carefully and deeply. But sometimes that's not the set of questions that the practitioners want to answer, right? And they care more about relevance. If you focus too much on rigor, it could be burdensome when sort of speed, agility, and even creativity are paramount. Right? But this is also where I think sort of generative AI can be really interesting or really helpful, right? Is that instead of treating these documents as static documents, we can actually get it to also do a bit of personalization, right? And that's sort of the work that we've been doing since the initial version, right? And how do we make these cards to be relevant for designers? So the first research question is, what does relevance mean in this context, right? And then how do we make this happen? So again, similarly, what we did is we recruited a few designers and trying to see what they mean by relevance. And essentially, when they say, they're trying to apply some designerly insight into their work, it generally falls into kind of three categories of things that they're looking for, right? Or trying to assess whether or not it's relevant for their work. One is who, right? If you do this work, who are your target users? Does that apply into my context? And then there's a question of what, right? What were you doing? What was done in this paper? And does that work in the domain, modality, the pain points that I'm trying to address, my clients, or sort of the metrics that I care about, right? Interestingly, they also care about relevance, and the perceptions of relevance also varies in which stage they're in. So if they're in research stage, they might want to know whether or not this insight relates to sort of other findings that they've had. If they're trying to ideate, if they're trying to come up with brainstorming ideas, they might want to think about whether or not these insights help them sort of generate new ideas. And finally, if they want to do evaluation, some of the things that they may care about is the metrics that was used in these papers, right? They might not care about other aspects. And so what we've done since is we've started sort of augmenting our card as well and allow users to interact with this to get additional insights from these papers. So I'll switch back to the screen. What we are allowing kind of users of this site to do is to input in what are they designing for, who are they designing for, right, and what stage of design that they're in. So they can indicate that, encouraging people to participate in an online health community, and they're designing for older adults. Okay. In this case, I've selected research, ideate, and evaluate sections, and you can kind of see this is sort of the additional insights that's being generated. So we first provide sort of inspirations and scope, right? In this paper, the authors study characteristics of individuals in tasks regarding participation and influence by incentives. Your aim to encourage older adults to join an online health community. Your design and the paper's context are similar, as both focus on participation motivation. While the paper uses incentives like lottery rewards, fixed payments, and charity, these can be adapted for older adults by choosing incentives that align with their values, such as health benefits, social incentives, and altruism. Right? And so all of this is generated by generative AI. So we're trying to see if we can use this to help do a little bit of tailoring and provide some inspiration. And this section, right, it's again broken down by the tasks that they're in. So if they're in an understanding part, they're trying to understand the literature. Say, the following user needs and pain points may apply in your design targets as well, right? Tailoring incentives, diverse engagement strategies. And then it talks about design ideas. Provide sort of some support in the ideation stage. Consider following components for your designs. Implement a customized dashboard where users can choose types of incentives based on their preferences. Introduce a mentorship program where older adults can both receive and offer guidance within the community. Create a reward system for participating in health-related community projects and volunteering opportunities. Again, this is all just generated by generative AI, sort of providing these inspirations. What are some of the methods that was used in the papers that might be appropriate for you? It got very specific, talked about logistic regression analysis, talked about some of the creative tasks that we used in the paper. And it also gets you to think about the metrics that you should consider when you're designing, right? Maybe you should look at participation rate. Maybe you should look at engagement quality. And that's what we've been working on with this tool. Oops. And again, we did a round of study, and we found that, oops, sorry. We found that these cards, our customized cards, sort of improved relevance, generativity, and inspirability, and also actionability, right? Furthermore, it also improved validity, right? So again, using these cards, allowing sort of for the tailoring, people thought the content was actually more relevant to what they need to do, find it to be more generative, inspiring, and actionable. What's kind of interesting is actually they thought it was more valid. And so that kind of leads into sort of my quick summary of our findings here, right? So again, more relevant, generative, inspiring, actionable with our new sort of personalization process. But it's kind of interesting, too, that they thought that with this type of personalization, it actually made them think that the science being communicated was more valid. Right? In some sense, I think it makes sense, right? They can sort of perceive how it's relevant for what they want to do. And part of our feature also allowed them to kind of, explore kind of the provenance of information. Where did these recommendations actually came from? Another thing is that we found, right, if we're thinking about relevance, right, again, this type of personalization is important in many different contexts, and relevance has been a topic that's been talked a lot about in translational science. And we found that in this context, at least we should be thinking about sort of three categories of things. Relevance to who they're trying to design for, what they're trying to design for, and where in the design process they are. But one thing that also came up that was kind of interesting through our interviews is that another type of relevance also matters, which is the designer's prior knowledge. And in some ways, this is also not surprising if you kind of look at information relevance theory, right? People's perceptions of values of information depends on what they already know. So if we're telling them, here are some of the metrics that you should apply, and they feel like, oh, I already know this, they might feel like, oh, this is a little bit not as relevant. So something that we could envision with our system in the future is somehow capturing some of that designer's own knowledge in the system so that we can sort of provide additional insights that they don't already have. Our work also showed that this process can improve kind of non-topically relevant paper. So as part of our study, we showed participants both a topically relevant paper. So for example, if you're designing for sustainability, we brought in a paper on sustainability design. But we also brought in some other theory paper, sort of social behavior change theory. And what they found is that those papers can also be really helpful, and the translation helped them see that, right? Although I suspect there's likely a limitation, right? Those social behavior change theories make sense because you're still ultimately designing for people, but I can imagine if you pull in some random paper from a completely different field, no matter what kind of personalization we do, you're still not going to find it to be useful for your design context. So that's the work that we've been doing with that. How much time do I have?
A couple minutes.
Okay, maybe I'll just stop there. We also have been doing a bunch of other work. I was going to show something else that we were doing, but let me just stop there and maybe just kind of jump ahead, right, to kind of the end here. Again, we're very excited about sort of thinking about generative AI in this context, right? Part of it is it's just work that people haven't been doing, right? So it's not like it's replacing someone's work, right? In many contexts, this type of translational work is actually not being done. And so we're helping to fill some of this gap. But you can definitely imagine envisioning sort of additional tools and resources that those translational fellows can be using to kind of complement their work as opposed to kind of replace them, right? And again, I'm really excited about this idea that we can create sort of new classes of translational artifacts and tools, right, with generative AI. So instead of just showing these papers and relying on other people to read your paper, we can convert them into cards. We can convert them into slides. We can convert them into posters, right? And that enables sort of more flexibility of use and potentially more people to adopt. So one of the things that we're currently working on is with some sort of folks in health trying to come up with if we can use this process to generate health policies, right, to kind of support policymakers in making their decisions. And again, the idea is that there's some interesting challenges here, both in terms of balancing kind of the generative side of generative AI, but also the validity, the information integrity, and also ensuring that the users actually trust this content, right? How do we make sure all this happen is something that we'll have to continue to work on. Anyways, I will stop here and maybe just take a couple of questions.